Hello and welcome to this episode of You're So Cool. On today's show, we have movie and TV orchestrator, conductor and composer extraordinaire, Mr. Tim Simonec. Now, if you're unaware of Tim's work, it reads like a who's who of film and TV, so go and check out his IMDB page right after the interview. This episode is brought to you by our very good friends over at Geek Music, purveyors of some of the land's finest cover music from the worlds of movies, television, gaming and anime. So check out what they have to offer. And please don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Leave a comment or a suggestion for both Geek Music and us here at You're So Cool. We hope you enjoy today's show. Let's get on with it. Hey Tim, thank you for joining us on the show today.
Thank you, Marc. Good to be here.
So, firstly, can you tell our viewers your name and your job title?
Okay, I've been called many things. I'm Tim Simonec. I've been the composer, I've been the arranger, I've been the orchestrator, I've been the conductor.
Can you explain what an orchestrator does and their position within the music department?
The position of orchestrator is a tricky one. Most producers and directors don't know what it is that we work with on movies. So I prefer to tell them I'm a conductor because everybody knows that. But as an orchestrator, what you do is basically you will take a skeleton of what the composer writes in a broken down form, and then you will fill in that skeleton, fill in all the parts for the entire orchestra.
And you mentioned conducting. Can you explain that role?
Conducting the orchestra is getting the nuances of performance out of certain sections, getting it out of everybody and getting them all to play together. When you see a conductor in a symphony piece, usually, the difference is usually in symphony, and I've done a lot of this, I've done a little, are pieces that they know. So the conductor will bring more nuances and more specifics, like certain tempos and certain things louder or softer, and he'll have those nuances. Now, when you conduct film music, you have to realize nobody in that orchestra has seen the piece. Okay, they're looking at it for the first time, which is one of the amazing things that studio orchestras do, in my opinion. I'm still in awe of that skill because they're reading it out for the first time, as opposed to a symphony orchestra that's played, Beethoven's Ninth 100 to 150 times with different conductors. So, and then you always have to remember when you're conducting film music, they're never looking at you at the first take. That's when you can make all your mistakes, because they have to look at the music to know it. So I always think the first time's a chance for me to get into more specifics. You're into interpretation, volume, tempos. Usually in film, tempos are done by click to coordinate it with the visuals. So, and when you do a symphony orchestra, you don't need click. You set the tempo.
Can you mention some of the projects you've been involved in and some of the composers that you've been lucky enough to work with?
The composers and projects I've worked on. I think I've orchestrated and conducted over 80 movies. So I would say with Michael Giacchino, who I started working with in 1997, and I worked with him till 2017 pretty much. That's where I did most of the big films. The Incredibles, as you see behind me, Ratatouille, Up, we did a lot, Inside Out, we did a lot of Pixar, a lot of work for Pixar, which was an absolute pleasure. One thing I'll add is Pixar, the difference between them is because a Pixar film has so many people involved on so many levels, they understand my particular role. Remember earlier on I said most directors and producers don't know what an orchestrator does. Guess what? They get it because they have so many different people that work on their films, thousands or hundreds, somewhere near that are all part of that same great thing.
You've worked a lot with Graham Revell over the years.
About 1991, I did a Wes Craven film with him called People Under the Stairs. And then the second film we did together was Hand That Rocks the Cradle. I did almost 40 films with Graham. We did a lot. The last one being Pineapple Express was the last time we worked together, the Seth Rogen film. I work with Chris Ting with The Associate, Kazam. I work with Basil Polidoris. Once I had the privilege of working with him on Serial Mom. I worked with Marc Isham on 42. I just finished working with a film with him that the title escapes me. It's a pretty crazy one, but let's say the next Nicolas Cage film to come out that Marc Isham scored, I worked with him, and on the TV show Once Upon a Time.
What was your journey into the music department, and how did you end up with such an illustrious career?
My journey is very interesting, I think. First thing, I started taking organ lessons when I was 8 years old. My parents loved music so much, and they bought a little spinet organ, which is usually everybody goes from piano to organ. I went to organ to piano. But if you think about it, when you play an organ, you're always setting sounds. And you're always changing, the colors and the registration of an organ to sound big, little, fluty, big pedals, big chords. And then I always thought, I told my mom later in life, I said, it's interesting you picked that because it was the perfect foreshadowing for my career. And then I started arranging for vocals. I had a little trio at the church. At a church, and I started writing vocal parts for the trio and playing, and then later on, I got into doing. I was really interested in doing more stuff for orchestra. I started with brass and rhythm, strings, brass, rhythm, and I started working it up through my college years. In fact, the interesting thing, I majored in Bible in college. I thought I wanted to be a minister. Again, Mom got smart after college. She said, you don't want to be a minister. What do you? She said, you love music. Get into music. And she kind of pushed me into making a career out of it. So I remember the first thing I did, a local pastor in Chicago, the producer of that show and director of that show, I knew him from when we were little. He came up to me and said, we want to get a Chicago visuals with like a nice action theme. Can you write that? And of course I never had, but I said, sure. And that was my first thing I did. I did it, and I was fortunate enough to work with Bruce Swedien as the engineer who did all the big Michael Jackson. He produced, he didn't produce them, but he was Quincy Jones's engineer. And he said, he was very encouraging to me. He said, you should do, because I said, this is the first thing I've ever done. And he said, maybe you should look into this more. So I went back to the producer of the show. I asked him, who else could I write for? And then he knew a guy who was doing religious films, and he said he probably would be interested in doing original music. So I called this guy. He was of all towns, Winona Lake, Indiana, but it was back in the 70s and 60s, not so much in the 80s before home video. Churches used to set up a 16 millimeter screen and show movies on Sunday nights. That was a big thing. So the biggest company that's the company I approached that did those films for the churches, really low budgets. I met that director, and I ended up doing about 25 to 30 of those films. My first budget, I will tell you, the film was called Hobo and the Runaway, and I had $460 to do a score. So that gives you an idea. But I did that, and then the last films I did with them, the budgets kind of crept up higher and higher, and we actually hired an orchestra. So they were doing a film. It's an old classic story, and that is Pilgrim's Progress. And they needed an orchestra, and I'd never done that. I'd done smaller things with them. So we ended up going to London and recording an orchestra. And it was the first time I really wrote for orchestra. And we went to London, recorded that score, and lo and behold, Eric Tomlinson, who was the engineer for all those big John Williams films, like the first one, Star Wars, Superman, all the first ones that were done in London, he was the engineer. And he listened to my music for Pilgrim's Progress, and he said, he said to me, maybe you should go to LA, and I took that as a big sign. So I went to LA, and there used to be this book, and some of you may know it. I think it still exists, Where to Sell Your Songs. And they had a chapter in there about agents that represent film scores. So, of course, I had this thing from Eric Tomlinson, you should do this. This was summer of 79, actually winter of 79. Part of getting me out of Chicago was a huge blizzard that I said, okay, that's it. I'm going to go to LA now and write film scores. So I went to LA, wrote to the films, and a lot of them were the big guys, who represented John Williams and the big guys at the time. But a couple of the other guys were smaller, didn't have quite the client list. They were all pretty nice to me. I remember one guy in the book said to me, at that time, he said, call me when you're making $100,000 a year. And I said, when I think I'm making $100,000 a year, you'll call me, But anyway, I went to one guy, and he thought it was great. He was amazing. And his assistant was a guy named Sam Schwartz, who is now, Gorfain Schwartz is the biggest agency in representing film composers. All the big boys are with him. And so I sent him my tape. He was blown away. He thought it was amazing. So I moved to LA. I moved, and I finally get settled here. I call him, and the first thing I get from him is, "Who are you?" Refresh my memory. So this is my first LA story. I do all this, moved there. I have an agent, so I'm told. No, then I don't have an agent. So, but through a lot of crazy things, including this assistant and the two assistants he had, they had back then it was cassette tapes. They'll have a big, pile of cassette tapes of young composers. And they picked mine inadvertently off, and they just loved it. They played it and played it. And they finally went to this agent, and he said, "Did you ever call this guy?" And that kind of got me my first agent. So anyway, through a lot of different things, he got me an appointment with a wonderful man who I have much to thank for, called Jack Hunsaker, head of music at Paramount TV. And at that time, in the 79, 80, 81, Paramount TV was all Gary Marshall's huge comedies, Laverne and Shirley, Happy Days, and so on, Mork and Mindy, Cheers, Taxi. So, I got to see the head of music, and one difference in the business then, the head of music for a studio, which is not the case now, the head of music for a studio could recommend people for jobs. They would actually approach them. Nowadays, it's done, the director as a friend, the producer as a friend, they're kind of middlemen. But then this guy had a lot of pull, and he just liked my music and liked me and got me some jobs. It got me, my first job was a Happy Days episode where Fonzie loses his cool with a Dracula type character. So if you ever in a rerun see that one, that one will have my name on it, because I just didn't write cues. I actually wrote the whole episode. And from there, I got, a little more, and then I got doing TV. And then this could be a huge part of my story, but I was just ready to write with Mike Post, who was the monster of TV back then. And he said, come in on Wednesday, and I want you to write on the A-Team. So I was so thrilled, because I was, at the time I wasn't working much, and that came amazing. But what also was happening at the time when I wasn't working much is I had this incredible stiff neck, and I noticed in my dexterity in my fingers, I couldn't play the piano much anymore. It was starting to go, and I knew something medical was happening. And when I finally found out what it was, they did tests with me, and they found that I had either an amazing amount of spinal fluid in my central nervous system or tumor material, which was much more dangerous. And I was supposed to go on a Wednesday to Mike Post. Monday, I was in the hospital right before that Wednesday, and they said, we have to operate on you. We have to do a scan. We have this new scan called an NMR, which was of course, they took the nuclear magnetic resonance and made it an MRI. And in there, they say, they could see that I had a mass or a tumor, and they said, we won't know till we go in, which it is. So it ended up being a tumor, and I was told I would never walk again. But a lot of people prayed, and miraculously enough, plus, I just started getting return. This was 1984. 1985, I could start walking again. And then through the next years was trying to get back as an orchestrator, doing all that I did, getting the work with Graham Revell, and that got me into the biz. But unfortunately, I came in disabled, but I was able to walk finally and conduct orchestras. I was technically a walking quadriplegic, still am. I started in a wheelchair in 84, got out of it in 85, got back into it around 2018. So you get my story of my career and my disability in once. We managed to get that all in.
So because of your disability, did you choose or find it was easier to work as an orchestrator rather than pursue a career as a composer?
What happened is all the producers I work with, including Jack Hunsaker, he was just retiring. And he said, the business has changed. He said, I don't have anybody I can recommend to you. And so what I did is I never really orchestrated. I mean, I always orchestrated my own stuff. And then I looked for jobs. That's where the jobs came up as an orchestrator. So rather than be a composer, which is my goal, I got sidetracked because of the whole disability into orchestrating some. And then I orchestrated, for a couple unknown composers or, struggling ones. And I luckily got to, Graham Revell and Michael Giacchino. And I got through them both, as orchestrators. And that's where I kind of in this business made my mark. Even though I have composed, I actually composed a lot of additional music for Anne Frank, the miniseries with Ben Kingsley that won an Emmy, and I got to compose a lot for that. And I had a couple little films of my own, and then the biggest film I did composition for was Whiplash. They brought me in to help with all the big band writing, and then Damien had me write cues, and the cues you'll see that are even though I'm not composer credit, my credit reads a little different, but all the live things you'll see in the movie, that the band's playing, that's my composition. So, and then of course that went on to get, very critically popular and nominated for an Academy Award.
Explain where the orchestrator fits within the music score process and how integral is it to the recording of the final music?
Now, in the process of the whole film process, the orchestrator comes in pretty much at the end. You're one of the last things. And the composer will write the sketches. Like I told you, you take the sketch and you flesh it out for the entire orchestra. The composer will write the sketches, get it approved by the director, and then start sending them to me. It's a short process. It's 3 to 4 weeks, 5 weeks if you're lucky. Sometimes, and now it's getting worse a lot with the easy ways to edit is digitally. It can be a week or two you have to do everything. So in the process, okay, composer writes it, director approves it, then it starts coming to me. Again, it could be 4 weeks, could be 1 week. And then we do it last. And one of the problems of being the last thing is sometimes the filmmakers get the idea that the score is going to save the film. So sometimes the pressure is even worse. They usually know if they have a stinker, but they won't admit it. So they want the score to rescue it. But I've always said you can't polish a turd, even though that's what most of us orchestrators end up doing. And I wouldn't say that. And I've been fortunate enough, especially with Michael, to get a lot of good films that were excellent films to be a part of, and I'm proud to be a part of them.
How has technology impacted your work as an orchestrator since you began in the late 70s and 80s to where we are today?
The process of orchestrating and the technology has been a crazy thing. When I started doing the first things in, I think it was 1979, 1980 actually, MIDI didn't exist. So when you would have to write a score, there was no way to mock it up like now. So actually they'd have to just trust you and get to the scoring stage. You could play it on the piano, but sometimes that would backfire. I'll never forget when I played it on the piano for one pilot. It never went anywhere, and the director had me play it on the piano, and he was just thrilled. The next day I had the whole orchestra sitting out there, and he comes running out into the room on the first take, and he's going, "What is this shit? What is this? This isn't what you..." Well, I said, I was on a piano yesterday. This is the whole band. "No, I don't like it. And, I hate it." So we had to try to, I had to write new stuff, and it was a crazy process. But that was in the day when they had to trust you and listen to it. Now it's gotten so sophisticated that you mock up you'll mock up almost the entire score. I did refer that in the process, and if you weren't aware of what that is you can actually play using machinery, that's the world of MIDI that sounds like trumpets, all the instruments, piano, strings, and you put that together and you can give a synth, a synth or a sampler presentation to the director. Now the problem with that is a lot of them fall in love with that sound, and actually the real orchestra versus the mock-up, what we call the synth mock-up, is nowhere near as good. But sometimes they learn to listen to it that way, especially to the untrained ear. But the technology's been huge. The world of MIDI has done some bad things, but a lot of great things for the process. And it's an integral part now. There is no trust me and let's hear it at the sound stage. They have a pretty good idea, a real good idea of what it's supposed to sound like before we actually do the actual process.
How much influence do you have when breaking down the original composition from the composer if you see errors or know that certain elements just won't work with a live orchestra?
What you do when working with a composer and your input in helping frame the final, will depend on the relationship between composer and orchestrator. You'll notice in the credits that usually guys start working with the same orchestrator for a lot of time. And that's because of that process, because it becomes like a shorthand between them. And the orchestrator has freedom to actually suggest things to the composer, and then you can say this might not work. I used to sometimes just, if I knew a part that he wrote, I would try to, as an orchestrator, make it more playable, maybe a little simpler than the mock-ups sounded on the synths, because knowing how an orchestra plays. So you do some fine-tuning, and depending, if the composer, and I did not work with any of those kind of composers, thankfully, a couple small projects, but usually if the composer does his work right, you as an orchestrator can jump right in and know exactly where to take off and where to make it better and where to just enhance what the composer did, which is what you want to do most, with the composer. Enhance and make what he composed as a sketch as good as possible when you actually do the final touches for the orchestra.
You've worked with some of Hollywood's biggest composers, Michael Giacchino, Graham Revell, Joseph LaDuca, etc., etc. Does every composer have their own process or nuances, or are there similarities between them all?
I found that the process of working will vary from composer to composer. Michael Giacchino has it honed down very specifically to what he wants. Graham was more of a kind of think it up as he's doing it. So what he would give me as a MIDI sketch, which usually was a printout, he would change it a lot on the soundstage. When he'd actually hear it, he would keep changing it and refining it. Michael heard it pretty much in his head and didn't change it except for small nuances that were picture related that the director wanted, So it depended. The regular process though is, a little bit of time. You take the sketch of the composer and blow it up to orchestra. I mean, the process is pretty simple, but you get to know the composer as like what Michael wants, what he likes from the other movies. That's why I said the relationship composer and orchestrator gets a lot of films. Same thing with Graham. I remember because Graham had a very unusual, very unique harmonic structure in his head. And I would, I'd revoice chords all over the place on the first time when we worked on Hand That Rocks the Cradle especially. And then I learned really quick, when he had a certain harmony in mind, that's what he wanted, And then I learned with Michael, in somewhere I could reharmonize some things at times, especially if it was more in the jazz industry, the jazz idiom. He wanted me to, because he knew that jazz was kind of my thing. So the process is pretty similar, but you learn about the uniqueness of each composer, and you learn it well because you won't be sitting in that credit as orchestrator too long. First one, don't ever rewrite anyone's melody. It is, I don't care if it's, if you come up with, the melody of the ages instead of that, it's not your time. You always, I revere their melodies the most. Just that's what I grab onto, and that's the most important thing. And especially with Michael Giacchino, he could write a good one, so he never had any inkling to change anything.
It looks like you've worked on pretty much every blockbuster franchise over the years, but was there any film that you really feel stands out from the rest, like you knew when reading the compositions that you felt, this is going to be amazing?
I had a feeling definitely that The Incredibles, when I was working on that this is going to be big. And Up was one. When I first started on this film, I thought, this is going to be amazing. And then both of those won Oscars. And then Oscar-winning a couple other films. I didn't know Whiplash. Nobody knew that came out of left field. Even though I read the script, I saw the short it was based on and everything, I had no idea it would be take over like it did. So there were a lot of surprises. The Star Trek films that I worked on with Michael, with 3 of them, I believe, you knew already what you had, And usually by the time I've got it, it's pretty end in the process. It's almost fully edited, so you kind of knew.
Going back to the very beginning, you started life as a composer. Can you tell us about your time on Happy Days?
Working on Happy Days was a lot of fun. It really was. Because again, when you work on TV, you didn't have to, of course, those were the days you didn't play anything for anybody, but you pretty much, you didn't have a lot of time, bam, bam, bam. You luckily, which isn't true today, I got to work with an orchestra on Happy Days. And I worked specifically on the show I mentioned, previously, the one where Fonzie loses his cool through a Dracula type character. But most of the other shows, be it Mork and Mindy, Laverne and Shirley, Cheers, they would want specific, Family Ties, I forgot to add. That was one I did a lot of. They would just say, we need this kind of piece. Because all those shows didn't have a lot of music. So when they would need a specific montage, or if they needed a sound alike for a pop piece, like we need something like this, but we can't license it, so you give us a little bit like that. But don't get close enough that, obviously, that you don't get an attorney call. I remember when we were doing Ratatouille, and Michael asked me on the one of my favorite cues there is when the rats cook the meal 2/3 of the way or through to the end. Michael says, well, it's in Paris. He says, can you give me enough American in Paris? Can you give me a lot of Gershwin quotes? So they're still all in there. I hope Disney's attorneys aren't listening. A lot of them we took away, the obvious ones, or we had to fudge them a little. But you're able to get the flavor of Gershwin, just a little of that into that piece of music, and that was real enjoyable.
As an orchestrator working alongside a regular composer, you're often tasked with supplementary composing for a show or a movie without credit. It's commonly known as ghostwriting. How common is it, and is it seen as part of the job to go uncredited?
That whole idea is very interesting because it's like I saw it firsthand when Graham gave me a credit as additional. He didn't on some earlier ones, but when he did, you have to go through, as being a writer, you have to go through the whole process, legally saying I didn't, everything a composer has to do is signs, that he didn't steal this, yada, yada, yada. You got to go through as the additional writer, which is, I can see why they don't want to give you that credit, because it gets it out there. It's interesting, I was in a seminar once, and it was with music heads, music supervisors, and she said something, and I had a buckle. I didn't want to. She said, "We know who writes everything and who doesn't, and those ghostwriters, we know who they are, and we try to get them work in the future," which is the biggest whopping lie I've ever heard, because they don't care to know, and they don't know, but it's something you do. You do, if the money is good enough, you do it, But I've done my share of it, and I learned with my last thing I did some ghostwriting for. The film ended up so well, I said I never want to give away my compositions. It's the cost is too high, even though I got paid very well. But it exists, and you'd be surprised. I've spoken to composers, that are up in age, up older than me, how many big names, use ghostwriters. It's pretty common. Lenny Niehaus was one of the top ghostwriters in Hollywood for a lot of big names. And Clint Eastwood found out that they were both in the service together, and he gave Lenny Niehaus many chances to compose many of his big films, which I thought was an amazing gesture on his part. But yeah, it's interesting you'd ask me that, Marc, because it's one of the dirty words, in the industry. But trust me, it exists everywhere. Maybe your favorite score, and you don't know it out there, was ghostwritten. I saw Hans Zimmer do something interesting. I learned so much from it. Because when I was functioning as composer, sometimes the director, who usually is asking you to change things, they say something and you intrinsically know it as a musician, no, it's not going to work. What Hans Zimmer did, which I thought was brilliant, the director asked, saying, I don't like the strings doing that high part. Could you have the trumpets do that? Now, the actual thing to say, no, they would sound terrible up there. You can't do that. You get in an argument, which is not good. Hans Zimmer goes, okay, let's try that. I mean, which was brilliant. Of course, when you did it, the director saw it was a stupid suggestion, and Hans didn't have to give him one syllable in argument. It was early on when I came to town, and it was a good lesson to learn.
You worked on the cult classic Army of Darkness, and obviously The Evil Dead had already made cult status way before the third movie. But was it fun to work on nonetheless?
Army of Darkness, working on that film, was very enjoyable on a lot of levels. It was interesting music. We recorded it in Utah, they were doing some films there. And I didn't know much about Evil Dead or everything until after I worked on that. And then I watched Evil Dead and realized, the campiness of it. And I thought Joe LaDuca's score caught it perfectly. Here's one thing we learned. When you score animation, don't ever leave this city to record it, because no one else can do it. I would say, and of course you do it there, and it's such a specific musical skill to change tempos, change styles just on a dime, And I remember we have one animated sequence in Army of Darkness, and it took us forever. And I don't think we ever got a good take. I think the mixer, Dennis Sands, saved that one on the mix, in Pro Tools. I don't even know if Pro Tools existed then, but it saved it in a lot of editing. It sounded, because it was pretty disastrous before that. So remember all the work behind the scenes when you see that scene in the Army of Darkness. Speaking of cult classics, I worked on The Crow. That was a huge cult classic, and I did that with Graham early on, and everything was so vanilla. It didn't sound anything like Graham. And so we recorded the orchestra, which was, but the final score, he used all the elements of world music, laid it on top of there. And that vanilla part was just the chords and all that. And the orchestra was secondary, and what came out was all the exotic world instruments he used. And it worked so well for the score.
Let's talk about Whiplash, which is on your credits list, but you had a significantly different role on that movie. Can you tell us about it?
Working on the film Whiplash, was very unusual. I got called in by the music director of the film, Andy Ross, who I had just met, and Andy was instrumental in getting me involved in the final process. But what they asked me originally to do was they wanted me to work on all the big band music in it, because it was such a pivotal part of the final project. So I came on, and my role was, to help with all the big band. Damien Chazelle knew a lot about big band music, but obviously he was a director and a little bit of a drummer in his day, but he wasn't like as intricately familiar with the style as he needed to be. And Justin, his collaborator and composer of some of the pieces in there, big band was not his thing either. So they brought me on. We needed, this kind of a big band film. And we needed to be very authentic. And what Damien had me do in that film, what I specifically did, was there was a lot of pieces where they'd be rehearsing the bands. A lot of them all over the film. Maybe there were 6 or 7 or 8 clips. And what he wanted me to do is write a piece beforehand. And then when he filmed it, he used actors that actually knew how to play the instruments somewhat. So they would actually look like they're playing the parts. So, because he wanted it to look very accurately, to look and sound like it, not as cheesy as some musical films where, a trumpet is playing and they're showing a violin and things like that. Damien wanted it so specific, so he was good like that. And I remember the one piece that I got to write, which I'm quite proud of, though it gets messed up in the movie, but on the soundtrack album, it was requested, every bands want to play that over, was the piece that J.K. Simmons, as the conductor, at the end of the movie, he introduces a piece, for the concert, and he tells the drummer who helped him lose his job. He tells the drummer it's going to be this, and then he announces a different piece, and that's the one where it screws up the drummer.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We're very excited to be here, kicking off the JVC Festival this year. I'm Terrence Fletcher, and these are some of the best musicians in New York, which means they're some of the best musicians in the world. And we're going to do some old standards for you, but first we're going to start out with a new tune by Tim Simonec called Upswingin'.
And when I went to write that, Damien told me, write the hardest piece you can write. He had suggestions for all the other pieces. He has, do something like this, and it was pretty easy. But when he said, write the hardest piece you can. So I ended up writing this thing called Upswingin', and it's in 7, and it's fast as you can imagine, and it's hard to play. It's hard to play. I've had studio players, and even when we recorded it, we had to do it in pieces and edit it together. But and the uniqueness of that film, which you don't know, is I met JK at the shoot, and then after the shoot, we bumped into each other at a restaurant. And he said, "This will probably be on the cutting room floor, but I just wanted to tell you, I introduced you as the composer of that piece while we were shooting the movie." And I figure, that probably won't make it in until I go see the preview screening. And so I actually get mentioned in a film as a composer. So I guess I better keep composing because, people heard that in the movie. Because I had people calling me from all over the country. After they'd see the film, they'd run out to a phone. They said, "I heard your name in the film." So it was kind of fun.
As a conductor yourself, have you felt like going into full-on crazy mode like J.K. Simmons' character at times?
Have I ever got like that? No. I like I said, I usually start this, I'm so respectful of studio orchestras. I tend to treat them better than most conductors. I know of such stories. Interesting thing, somebody was doing a review of Whiplash and they said, "Oh, that's so fake. No conductor would be like that." I had a lot of friends that when they went to music school, at private places, not public schools, not like, a major university, but a private, well-known, music institution. I've had 3 or 4 of my good friends say, I've had conductors worse than J.K. Simmons. Fletcher is the name of the character. But I never did that. I never did that. So, like I said, I tend to love the orchestra. I realize how important they are in the process. But believe me, those guys do exist. So I was starting this thing. A critic said nobody like that exists. I said, do your homework. Ask some guys who went to, to music schools. See if they'll back up the fact that it happens.
Let's talk about Up. The opening track is almost a calling card for an Oscar nomination. Did you feel when orchestrating that was going to be something special?
First of all, I have to do a confession. It wasn't ghosted, nothing like that. But I have to digress a little bit. I'll do this. I've had a chance at the end of their lives to meet and go to lunch and be friends with great orchestrators who I've admired. Erwin Kostel was the first one. And I remember him telling me, what can I teach you? I said, are you kidding? In an hour of lunch, he'll teach me more than I'm going to learn in the next 20 years. And then Greg McRitchie. And unfortunately, they both passed away before, you know how you do things in our business. You say, oh, let's go to lunch sometime, and then you don't do it. So my good friend, one of the great engineers, Dan Wallen. Dan Wallen says, I just did lunch with, and he mentioned some guys, all legends, but he said he added the word Jack Hayes. And when he said that name, and because of my past history, I said, Dan, set up a lunch this week with you, me, and Jack Hayes. So he was one of my true heroes. Look him up on IMDB. It's the films he's done, the Oscar-winning films he's had his hand on as orchestrator. He was one of the best ever. I won't go into everything because his credits are too numerous, probably 300-400 movies. And Dan Wallen, while you're at it, same thing, maybe 200 films, 300 films. So I got to meet Jack, and he was 86 at the time. And we got to meet, and I remember him saying, you get called anymore. And I think he hadn't worked with anybody since he'd worked with Randy Newman on The Natural, which, I think the year was like 2003. That's been quite a few years. I said, what would you do if you got called now to work? He said, I'd probably die of the shock. I said, well, don't die, but we're doing a film right now called The Incredibles. And I'm going to call you in May to do a couple orchestrations. And Michael Giacchino, he revered talented guys, the older animators, the older composers. There was always a thing with him. So I told him about Jack, and he looked up his credits. He said, oh yeah, let's put him to work. So he did a lot of Michael's early films. And one of the things he did, which was amazing and brought me to tears, was when the rat in Ratatouille climbs up this whole maze, and he comes out on a thing, and he looks at Paris, and you hear this beautiful piece, Michael's composition, but Jack actually arranged that. And it was so brilliant. And if you ever remember that piece, he did a thing he did an arranger, orchestrator job that was spectacular. And Michael would always use that piece in any live orchestra concerts he did. Maybe even to this day, I haven't seen any in a while. But okay, so I say all that now to get back to the point. Jack was starting to fail, a little bit, because he was, by this time when we were doing Up, he was 90, 92. But I knew this, this was, so actually The Married Life, that great montage, was the last thing Jack Hayes did before he passed away. And he did it like only Jack could. And it's funny because I orchestrated in Ratatouille, I probably orchestrated Up. I orchestrated so many other things, but not that. He did. So I don't want to take the credit for it because that's an amazing piece. I will tell another funny story about it though. We were recording that montage, The Married Life, and my wife was at the session just observing, and she is, she cries at the drop of anything. She's a crier. And we were rehearsing that montage, and she was crying and crying, every time. Because we did about 6 takes before we finally kept one. And she was crying more and more. And the director, Pete Docter, said, "We're going to keep recording this cue till Janet's in the fetal position." So.
Tim, thank you so much for joining us on the show. It's been a real pleasure having you on. You're so cool.
It was a pleasure to do it. I love to share what I can in my life.
Hey guys, well, we hope you enjoyed today's episode. Tim really has had such an illustrious career, and he had so many stories that we probably could have chatted for hours. So maybe we'll get him back on again on a future episode. What do you think? So, before I bid you a fond farewell, once again, don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and we look forward to seeing you all again on the next exciting episode. And don't forget, you're so cool.